We all know Dr. Sachin Chittawar, the practicing endocrinologist in Bhopal, academically oriented, passionate about his patients as well as research. So I would welcome him to talk on generation 2 basal insulins, a new benchmark in redefining glycemic control. Over to you, Dr. Sachin.
Thank you, Dr. Anjali, for kind introduction. And I was listening regarding the latest developments. Definitely, there are a lot many things to be covered over the years now since the technology is taking over. But what is very important in management of diabetology is, unfortunately, till date, there are people who need to be educated with respect to how to properly take care of diabetic patients. And your lecture with respect to the kind of approach you told was something which we needed, is the need of hour. So I've been given the task to talk about the second generation basal insulin, that is a new benchmark for redefining glycemic control. So I'll be talking about the advantages of second generation insulin over the first generation, differentiating between the second generation basal insulins, the newer ones. There are two in the right now in the armamentarium, and features of new Glargine 300 reusable pen and cartridge. So at the outset, I will like to thank uh, Sanofi for giving me this opportunity, and definitely kudos to the organizers of IDEC for their successful row of conferences, and I've attended them uh, personally also, and the kind of show they create, I hope they will continue in future. So the evolution of basal insulin development from generation 1 to generation 2 basal insulin. What are the limitations which we overcame? Actually, it was NPH, which was the poor man's basal insulin. Still, we are using it, and I find it useful in some of the special tricky conditions. It has a huge limitation of having a peak late night and the fall effect. Basically, the insulin levels used to go down early morning, and that used to lead to the dawns phenomena, early morning hyperglycemia. That's why later on, the development of first generation, that is the Glargine, came in, which had less peak. It was relatively a peakless as compared to NPH. So less episodes of hypoglycemia, and the dawns phenomena was also not there. But there were some limitations. Then there was insulin Betamir, but it had to be given twice daily. It had some neutrality with weight, but somehow it did not pick up. And then the basal insulin, Degludec and Glargine 300. These are more or less comparable insulins with which are almost peakless, longer half-life, less of hypoglycemia, and they actually led to the introduction of new terms like nocturnal hypoglycemias. So these are the two insulins which I'll be comparing and talking of. Generation 2 basal insulin demonstrates lesser hypoglycemia as compared to generation 1. So these are the addition data where they have compared Glargine 300 with Glargine 100, and it is outrightly favoring Glargine 300 in majority of them. Some of them it could not achieve superiority. See, for nocturnal hypoglycemia, it's more or less same. And this is for the confirmed hypoglycemia in the BRIGHT study. This is another study, the Begin Bolus study, where also it is favoring, actually as compared to Glargine 100, Degludec is little bit better. And so Glargine 300 has lower rate of any time of and nocturnal hypoglycemia. All kind of hypoglycemias are less when you're using Glargine 300. As compared to Degludec, lower rate of nocturnal hypoglycemia is the only feature which predominantly comes in the picture when you compare it with the first generation insulin. So Degludec has advantage of nocturnal hypoglycemia, but Glargine 300 has got both. All kind of hypoglycemias, and it is also lessening the nocturnal hypoglycemia. Glargine 300 demonstrates better A1C reduction, lower risk of hypoglycemia, and weight gain compared to Glargine 100. So any time of the day, see this better A1C reduction with lower hypo and weight gain with Glargine 300 versus Glargine 100 at month 12. So the data is also looking robust, and that there is durability also. A question comes in, So what are the advantages of this generation 2 basal insulin over generation 1? Stable and prolonged action, as I've already said, greater than 24 hours, lesser glycemic variability, as Manoj was talking about, effective and sustained glycemic control, less overall and nocturnal hypoglycemias, safer during titration, minimal weight gain, and flexible dosing. Differentiating between this generation 2 basal insulin, there are two right now. So how to different? They have different modes of action. Degludec, I will say, it has got this unique technology of reverse albumin binding and formation of hexamers. And these hexamers, they slowly degranulate and gives the advantage of a peakless insulin. The same, the concentrated glargine is basically forms a depot, and this following the subsequent subcutaneous injection, and it precipitates amorphously, creating a subcutaneous depot at a physiological pH. An active metabolite, that is 21A GLY human insulin, forms and is released slowly from the depot to the circulation. So more or less, in whatever way they have achieved, they have made it slowly accessible to the extracircular circulation, extravascular circulation, so that it is almost making the physiological release of basal insulin. So the BRIGHT study, the first head-to-head study comparing efficacy and safety of glargine 100 as compared to dagludec 100. So multi-center open-label trial, where they have compared this glargine 300 with dagludec, and the screening, I will not go much in details. The eligibility was greater than 18 years, and it had two arms. One arm had glargine 300 once daily, the other arm had dagludec, and starting dose was 10 units as per labeling. And there was a follow-up. So what they brought in was the A1C reduction was almost similar, little bit better for glargine 300, I will say, but it is not that statistically comparable. So almost both the insulins were comparable and they were non-inferior. But when it comes to the incidence of hypoglycemia, better with glargine 300, less episodes of hypoglycemia, and the event rates were also less. And nocturnal hypoglycemia, here also the glargine 300 scores over degludec when it is assessed for nocturnal hypoglycemia. This is what we are talking from the very start of our lecture. So lower variability with glargine 300 as compared to degludec 100. It appears to be more of a peakless insulin, and with within day variability with smooth GIR was significantly lower, that is 20% lower with glargine 300 as compared to dagludec 100. So this 20% less variability is something which gives advantage to this molecule. So how does this basically the type 2 CGM study, because whenever you talk about variability, when you talk about time in range, you need to assess as per the time in range. And so this is glargine and degludec, which were compared, and see what the data is. Comparable time in range with glargine 300 as compared to degludec, and time below the range was markedly lower for glargine 300 across categories of hypoglycemia. That is something which we also wanted as a desired effect. And here the glargine 300 scores over degludec. So one care, this is the real world data of adult type 1 diabetes using CGM, and they assessed for time in range, and the secondary endpoint was time above the range and time below the range. This is what we do in the conventional CGM studies for time in range. Similar time in range, time in above range, and time below range profiles between glargine 300 and IDEC 100. When it comes to type 1, they are comparable. Difference is favoring glargine 300 for time in range, and that is there was a difference for 70 to 140 and 70 to 180. That was the difference, and time above the range greater than 180 milligram per deciliter. So one case study showed that in real world setting, in adults with type 1 diabetes, the effectiveness and safety of glargine 300 was similar to dagludec 100 in those switching from first generation basal insulin. However, more people on glargine 300 remained within target glucose range at night versus dagludec 100. So the advantages of glargine 300 over dagludec. lesser glycemic variability, lesser anything hypoglycemia during titration, lesser nocturnal hypos, lesser risk of hypos within when albumin levels are low. As I was talking about this unique technology of reverse albumin binding, if there is over the top of it, if there is hypoalbuminemia, definitely it affects the response of degludec, and better time in range profiles and lesser weight gain. Any insulin which is causing less of variability, less of hypos, less of, I will say, time below the range, will definitely will have its neutral effect or beneficial effects with respect to weight gain. What are the unmet needs with available reusable insulin pens? There are some unmet needs when it comes to pen because errors in insulinization is common. Mismatch of cartridge and pen, mistaking rapid-acting insulin with basal can be dangerous, and need for more patient-friendly device. So there is always this. Basically, the unmet need for pens will continue because we will definitely be more greedier with respect to the kind of response we want to have it for our patients. Because ultimately, it is the patient-centered approach which actually wins in long run in diabetes. Can an insulin pen with a simpler operation mitigate the errors and risk of mismatch? This is the question. So Glargine 300 usable pen and dedicated cartridges, simple to use and mitigate the risk of mismatch. They have a replaceable cap. So they have made some changes. Cartridge is pre-assembled to a labeled cartridge holder, and joint interface between the cartridge and pen body is mutually exclusive. So this is basically they have improved, and over the top of it, they have this 1.5 ml cartridge, and they say it requires lower injection force, and this is 3:1 mechanism ratio as compared to the older pen. So they have actually grown up as their Glargine 100 pen, and with smaller cartridge diameter, lesser insulin volume leads to higher mechanism ratio and lesser injection force. So these are some technicalities. And so a dedicated replaceable cartridge unit, they have now introduced it. Total dose in the cartridge is 450 units. So they are offering more dose. And there are issues with respect to the larger dose required. But when it comes to variability, when it comes to per unit cost, when it comes to the other factors which are actually judged in economics, it appears to be cheaper than its comparable or rather competitor brand. So the dose dial grip holds time for 5 seconds for full dose recovery, inject multiple doses with a penalty-free dose correction facility, and mechanical last dose stop is there. So there are so many features which were lacking in the generation 1 now have been introduced with flying colors. So the least weight with optimal physical dimension for Glargine 300 usable pen, they have compared it with the other pens of other brands, and it is something which is showing a cost difference between the others when it comes to the weight. So simplicity, aesthetics, durability, functionality, all the features are actually being incorporated nicely in this generation 2 pen, and that is making it more attractive for us, for our patients, and for them it will be more friendlier, and basically they can use it with ease. So to summarize, generation 2 basal insulins have an array of advantages over generation 1, like better efficacy, lower variability, less hypo, and weight gain. And among generation 2, Glargine 300 has demonstrated lesser hypo during titration period, lesser glycemic variability, and better time in range profiles. Mismatch of insulin pen and cartridge is not uncommon and sometimes may lead to serious consequences. So new Glargine 300 reusable pen and dedicated cartridge has unique features that mitigates the risk of mismatch and may lead to simplified insulin delivery. With that, I will end my talk. Thank you. Thanks a lot for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. Chittawar, for such a wonderful presentation. Indeed, we are ahead as the generations of newer medications are coming up. They are helping our patients to combat the hypoglycemia. Indeed, insulin management is something which is an ever expanding universe kind of a thing, because the better we do, the better we realize what are the fallacies and we want better things to come up. So I would see whether there are any questions in the chat box. I don't think there are any questions in the chat box, but thank you for a wonderful presentation on newer basal insulins, and we look forward to have you again in future. Thank you so much.
Thank you.